I remember the most extraordinary feeling I've never had again, sitting in the back of a taxi with him, talking and having this weird feeling like I'd known him forever. I had never felt so comfortable with someone, and that was the beginning of an incredibly passionate, beautiful, wonderful love affair with the most wonderful man, and I didn't realise that within a few days the whole thing would crumble.
Welcome to At Work With. I'm your host, Anna Merchant. Today's guest is Barbara Want. Barbara is a journalist and producer who worked at the BBC during the 80s and the 90s, producing for programmes like Panorama, Newsnight, and The Money Programme. In 2006, Barbara experienced a devastating loss that changed everything. In 2010, she wrote a memoir about it, a raw, honest account of grief. Then she stepped back from public life. Today we're talking about the grief, not the sanitized version, but what it actually looks like, how we understand it, and how we move forward with it, not past it. This is a conversation about resilience, loss, and what happens in the decades after tragedy when the cameras stop rolling and everyone else moves on. Please welcome Barbara Want. So Barbara, thank you for being here. So before we go into the topic, I would love to start at the beginning, and I want to know more about you. So where did you grow up? What were you like as a kid?
I grew up in a very boring part of the suburbs of London. It was a place called Pinner. It was a new housing development built in the 60s on the edge of greenbelt land, where the most exciting thing that ever happened was that people would wash their cars every Sunday. And I had a very ordinary, pretty standard middle-class life. I went to a comprehensive school a couple of miles away. We used to go walking around the golf course at the weekends. There was nothing particular about it, except that I was very ambitious at school. I was very academic, and I was really keen to do well academically, and I pushed myself to do that. And at school, I was told not to have ambition, and I don't think my school encouraged it, so I kind of forged my own path. And I wanted to go to Cambridge, and I worked really hard to get there on my own. And I got a place, and I got in. And to me, that was kind of the beginning of a really exciting life.
That's so exciting. And do you think it was just the time around the 60s and the 70s? And was it more of a female thing that they just weren't encouraging because you were female? Or?
It's really interesting you've asked that. I think it was partly to do with being female. I don't think girls were encouraged as much as they are now. And I think politically, there was a sense that anyone who stood out was less important than the people who needed support, who didn't stand out. And I had a real sense that if I expressed ambition, it went against me. I can remember the head teacher calling me into her study. I'd done something naughty, and she called me in and she said, "So what do you want to do with your life?" And I said, "Well, I really want to go to Cambridge to study." And she said, "That is such an arrogant thing to think you could do." And at that moment, I realised that I had to do it on my own, which is a real shame. I think things are different now, but it really stayed with me that wanting to excel or wanting to be ambitious was not supported. And I did a careers guidance session and was told I ought to apply to be a management trainee at Debenhams in Harrow. And I thought, that is not what I want to do. And so I went and did it on my own. And I think that was the beginning of realising I had to find my own way in life, and it wasn't always going to be easy. Because back in the late 70s, if you were a woman and you had ambition, it wasn't easy. When I got to Cambridge, I was the first in the cohort of the first women ever to join my all-male college.
What was it that you were studying in?
So I went to Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge. It was a college, one of the oldest. It was 800-ish years old. It was an all-male college. Wow. There were 450 students, and 35 of them in the first year were women.
Oh, my God.
And I studied social and political science. And most of the students, the majority of students at that time were men. Most were public school. I was a woman from a state comprehensive. It was quite a challenge.
And by public school, just you mean private?
Private school.
Educated.
Yes, most were privately educated and I wasn't. And so I did feel a bit of a fish out of water.
And what was, before we go into your studies, but what was your environment like at home with your parents? Were they encouraging?
Yes, my parents were encouraging. My dad encouraged me. Yeah, they were supportive. I can't say that there was anything different. I mean, yes, I had to. Without their support, I wouldn't have done it.
Mm-hmm. So I'm really interested. So you studied social and political science, which I could not find about you on the internet, so that's news to me. What drew you into journalism? What was that path from Cambridge to journalism to then the BBC?
So I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And in my second year, I started writing for the student newspaper because I figured if you don't know what you want to do because you're interested in lots of things, maybe try journalism. Mm-hmm. So in my third year, I thought, better apply for some traineeships in journalism. And I applied to the BBC. Now, what I realised was to get onto one of the BBC's sought-after graduate training schemes, you needed to watch a lot of television. Mm-hmm. You needed to be across the news. You needed to know what was going on. There was one television in the college, in the junior common room. Mm-hmm. So I went down to the JCR to watch the television. But I went in, remember, it was an all-male college. Mm-hmm. Well, the news wasn't on the television. Guess what was on?
Sport.
It was football. So I thought, what am I going to do? So I walked through the city to the local branch of John Lewis, and I bought a black and white television for £47, which was a huge amount of money. I dragged it back to my room. I put it on the table, and I sat there, and I watched for 10 days. I watched the news solid.
Oh, wow.
I went to my interview at the BBC, came back. I took the television back to John Lewis, got my money back. I said it didn't work properly. I got my £47 back, and I got the job at the BBC.
Oh, wow. So you were at the BBC, you were a producer on big programmes that, like, you know, I've watched as well, Panorama, Newsnight, The Money Programme. What was the world like at that time in the BBC, and what kind of stories were you chasing? Because it's quite a variety that you worked on.
I worked on a lot of different programmes, but ultimately television journalism was about getting a story, telling it simply. As a producer, you were a master of juggling. It was like three-dimensional chess. You had to get the pictures, and in those days, getting the pictures meant literally getting a physical tape of pictures from the library. You had to write the script on paper. You had to send a camera crew out to record interviews. Sometimes I would go and do them. Sometimes I'd send a reporter out to do them. You were pulling things together, creating these reports against the clock, all the time. It was incredibly stressful. So on Newsnight, you might have an 8 or 9 minute slot to fill in the evening. And you had to fill it, and you had to get it right, and you had to move the story on. You had to have the right pictures. You had to tell the story the right way. It was really, really stressful. It probably still is. Working on Panorama, even more so. Turning around a 40-minute programme in a short amount of time, often with really controversial topics, often working with lawyers to make sure what we transmitted was correct.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Often working through the night, editing through the night, juggling constantly, driving a team through the process, getting the stuff together, getting it edited. Often our programmes were finished a minute before transmission.
Oh my God.
It was
like
tough.
They show you on TV.
It was challenging,
wow.
but tough. And I suspect it's still tough.
And what was it like being a woman in the BBC world in the 80s and 90s?
At the beginning, it was still quite a male world. I can't say that anything terrible happened to me apart from having my bottom tapped a couple of times, which at the time was I was annoying. Now you'd probably get sacked for that.
Yeah.
I think it was a pretty open place, really. There were women. I do remember a very senior woman telling me that when she had got pregnant, she was sacked. And this was before legislation that meant you couldn't. So I was aware you had to really fight hard to be a woman in the BBC and to do well. But it was generally a very supportive place. And I'm sure is even more so now. But I can't really complain about it. We might have been in a minority, but we weren't badly treated.
And that's obviously where you met Nick Clarke.
I met the love of my life.
So you met him, you got married in Mauritius, you had twin boys. What was that life like as you were building it? Because you met him much later on in your journey, right? BBC.
So he was older than me, so I was about 27 when I met him. We met when we were one of my first assignments where I was sent out of the office to make what we called an on-the-day report, which was you didn't pull your report together in the studio, you went out and filmed it fresh. And I was doing an on-the-day report with Nick, and I'd been sent all the way to Wandsworth, which is about 3 miles from Shepherd's Bush. And we came back to the studios with our tapes and our footage in a taxi. And I remember the most extraordinary feeling I've never had again, sitting in the back of a taxi with him, talking and having this weird feeling like I'd known him forever. I had never felt so comfortable with someone. And that was the beginning of an incredibly passionate, beautiful, wonderful love affair with the most wonderful man. And we got married in Mauritius, and it took us a long time to have children. Eventually, my twin boys arrived. I stopped work at the BBC because I couldn't travel the world and edit through the night with small children. I was really lucky. I was commissioned to write a book. So I left the BBC, wrote the book, and in June 2005, I had a party at my house as a published author.
Amazing.
My 3-year-old boys were there. Nick was there. He got me a little desk mount that said author because he knew I always wanted to publish a book. And I was so excited and so proud. And it was just the most beautiful moment. We were so happy. And I didn't realise that within a few days, the whole thing would crumble.
I think that's how it hits you, right? You never think that will happen to you. And it's always like, oh, that's happening. And it's crazy because I think 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 of us are impacted or are family members of someone impacted by cancer. So Nick was diagnosed a couple of days after that.
Yes, very shortly after that.
So it's a tough question, but what was going through your mind when you first found out the first couple of days?
The first thing I thought, apart from the obvious, which was just completely breaking down, the first thing I thought was I was so angry at myself for not having suspected he might have cancer. Because he wasn't himself, he'd lost weight. These are all things that from the outside you can say, well, it would have been obvious, you should have noticed it, but when you're there, you don't. And that sense of huge anger at myself that somehow I hadn't known was what overtook me. The second thing was physically, I was so churned up, I stopped eating. The third thing was we had 3-year-old twin boys. And suddenly I was faced with looking after them, supporting him, and it was terrible. And anyone who's gone through this will know how terrible it is. In his case, it was compounded by the fact that very shortly after he was diagnosed, he had to have his leg amputated. Yeah. It was what they call, rather brutally, a hind quarter amputation, which is basically the whole leg comes off, there's no stump, which completely dismembered him, disabled him, disfigured him. I went with him to the operating theatre, and the sense that I had to be strong was so hard. The minute he went through the doors in the operating theatre, I just fell on the floor, just collapsed. So it was everything. It was terrible.
And in Nick's case, of course, from what I've read, it was so quick. It wasn't my dad passed away of cancer, and his took about 2 to 3 years. And I feel like it's what you alluded to before about, not seeing the signs. You wouldn't see the signs because you wouldn't know what to look for. I think it's a human nature, right, to protect yourself and protect your brain. So even if you think you have a gut feeling that something might be wrong, whereas in my dad's case, before he was diagnosed, he was getting ill a lot. And my dad's he was never ill. He was always, he was overweight, but he was never ill. And I think we deep down were like, well, something's not right with him, but it could be his diabetes. We could never even fathom the fact that he would have blood cancer. So going back to Nick's story, and so by 2006 in August, Nick was back presenting, and we spoke about briefly the award-winning audio diary that he kept about his diagnosis, fighting to be normal. And I know I said to you before, it took me a lot of goes to actually go through that. I think the first time I listened to it, as soon as I heard your voice on it, I just burst into tears because I knew the story. And then I tried to listen to it again. I finally got through it a couple of days ago. What was it like for you filming that whilst living in that story as well?
Recording it.
Recording it, yeah. Because you were everywhere. You were at the hospital, and then you were going to pick the boys up, and then I think there was a section where you went on a holiday to Slovakia where Nick was like, "I want to come as well." It was so beautiful to listen to, but what was that like recording it?
So, being a journalist my job was to see events and tell the story of them. So it came incredibly naturally to want to make the programme, as it did to Nick. And it gave me a purpose. I loved recording it because that's what I loved doing. And it was like stepping outside myself and telling the story of somebody else. But when we heard it put together, so I didn't put the programme together, but I recorded it. When we heard it, we were sitting in the car in France and a tape was, I think it was couriered over. And we heard it together and we were both in shock. I was almost in tears and Nick was really angry and upset because it ended on a very negative note. And the last words in the audio diary were, "There's cancer in the air and it's scary." And I think I said that. And he was upset because he was in that battle to live that you probably know, which includes denial and a refusal to believe you could possibly die. And I'd voiced the unspoken, which was that we were facing a death sentence, which was something we never spoke about together, ever.
And he was very positive, even listening to him on the tape. Very positive. Even he talks about when he's woken up, obviously the next day, and he's like, but he's not reacting to someone be completely distraught that they've lost their leg, and he's like, yeah, and then I'm going to leave soon, and then you're wheeling him out. I think it was so beautifully. I felt like I was watching you and Nick when I was listening to it. So by August 2006, Nick was back presenting. Then in September, the way that you explained it, you were at Boots counter, choosing face creams when Nick called you back when he was re-diagnosed. Post that time,
I'd forgotten I was in Boots.
You wrote in one of the articles that I read that you were, and I'm going to read this because otherwise I'm going to cry or mess it up. You write that the horror of the moment was physical. A bullet of ice seemed to penetrate my body and shoot through my heart, my limbs, my nerves, every finger and every toe, and then I started to shake. And this is one of the reasons I was like, I don't think I can read this book. What were the next couple of days like post his re-diagnosis?
I had forgotten that, and it really was physical.
Yeah.
I mean, I felt all those things and shaking. And I suppose deep down, even though we were both fighting to keep going, and I suppose we were in a sort of denial, disbelief. We spent a lot of time, he was bedridden a lot of the time. I just remember spending a lot of time lying on the bed next to him, just talking. And the moment I do remember was when we realised how bad it was. I just held his hand and said, "You're the best friend I've ever had." And in those, that was sort of all I needed to say really. It said everything. It said, "I'm terrified of losing you. I'm sorry for all the bits I didn't do well that I would love to have done better. I'm sorry this is happening to you. I'm just, yeah."
And you end the book, and it's a very beautiful way to put it, but you say that death can be brutal, but it can also be very beautiful as well.
I think we were very lucky that his death was a beautiful death, because many aren't. And you don't realise that until afterwards, because death can come in all sorts of ways, but for some people it is brutal, and it's the people with them at the end for whom it's hardest. And in some ways I think he was lucky, I was lucky. It happened very, very quickly. And I realised he was dying, and I literally just held his hand and talked to him and said, "When you wake up, you will find that you're with me and the boys in a field going for a walk. It'll be lovely. We'll be there for you." And I suppose I just felt that it was all I could do, but he just did slip away to me telling him that.
And I know I said this to you in the prequel, but my mum always says that, when someone gets cancer, it's almost like the whole family dies with them. And then they continue on that journey when the person goes. But so moving forward with that, you then ended up writing a book called Why Not Me, which we've spoken about before. And it was very soon after his death. It was only 3.5 years after his death. And it's brutally honest. Obviously, I've read snippets of it. I've read some samples and stuff. Why did you share so many things, whether you're talking about whether you felt like you loved your kids, your, issues with your friends, and just how you felt like it was such a raw memoir almost.
So there's two reasons I wrote the book. The first reason was that when Nick was ill, he was commissioned to write a book about his illness. And I said to him I wanted to be part of that because I wanted to tell the story of the carer and the loved one, and it's a hard journey for them. And when he died, the advance we'd had from the publisher had been spent. And the publisher wrote to me at Christmas to say, "Happy Christmas, don't worry about the advance." And I thought, my God, they are worried about the advance. And so I either had to pay it back or I had to give them a book. Yeah. And so I thought, well, I'll write the book. I'll pick up where he left off. And I thought he might have written some of it. And I went through his computer and he hadn't written very much. He'd written about a chapter. And I began to realise there was a story I had to tell, which was the story of grief and how brutal and horrible it can be. And it is about huge anger, and it is about most people abandoning you. And it is about having ugly, horrible thoughts of fury and anger and bewilderment and fear and desperation. And I wanted to say all of that and write about it in its pure form because I felt I kind of owed it to other people who were going through it. So I was brutal in that book about what happens, but it's everything that happened in it is true. And I know from other people, it is what happens to lots of people in grief.
And you wrote that loss never diminishes and grief never ends. Usually you'd find grief books ending with like a bit of a happy note. Why did you feel like that was such an important message?
About 6 months before Nick died, somebody told me that 3 years after losing their husband, they'd found a note from him in a pocket and they'd felt overwhelmed like this. And I thought, how odd, 3 years on. And I then realised after losing Nick that it is true, that it never goes away. Why would you get over it? Yeah. I was with him for 19 years. He formed who I am. Most of my adulthood was with him. We became, in a beautiful relationship, you become one person. And if one person goes away, you don't just lose them, you lose yourself. And that never goes. I miss him still today.
When I was reading that, I really resonated with that because it's going to be 7 years since my dad's passed. And I still have that where I feel like you learn to live with the grief, but it doesn't go away. So there's a really great TED talk about a woman who lost her child. And she was like, I never moved on from the loss of a child 20 years later, but I moved forward with it. And I always feel with my dad, I feel like there's this dark cloud that follows me everywhere. But I think my coping, it's like I couldn't talk about it. That's why it's like 3 years is very soon.
It is soon.
This is the first time even I'm talking about it so openly. But it's always almost this hole in your heart that follows you, especially since I've had my son, like anything small he does. And it's just, there's not a moment or, where there's a happy moment or sad moment or, even when I was coming to do this interview, I was like, oh, my dad would be so proud that, I was interviewing an ex-BBC journalist. So it doesn't go anywhere. I think you just learn to live with it and you just learn to move it, take it with you almost.
There's an analogy which bereavement counsellors use, which is imagine a stone or a pebble or a round thing in a jar, and it's very big and it fills most of the jar, and that's your grief at the beginning. And over time the jar gets bigger because other things happen in your life.
Yeah.
The stone or the pebble is still the same size, but there are other things in your life and you're still living with it, but the other things have helped you learn to live with it and to become the new person you have to be, but it never goes away.
It's so true. And that's such a great analogy. One of my friends asked me when I had my son, she was like, do you feel like a different person now? And I was like, no. I was like, when I thought about it, I was like, I changed as a person the day that my dad died. So my life is before he passed to after he passed. And I just think that when you have a big trauma in your life, so my two people, I was kind of reborn almost after he passed away because I had to learn to live without a parent because I was quite close to my parents. I was the only child. But yeah, it doesn't go away. And that's why your book and the way that you're writing, I just felt so seen. And I shared it with my mum as well. I was like, you need to read this because, as my dad passed away, my mum was very young. She was like early 50s when he passed. So you did some press for the book, and then you also joined Winston's Wish as a trustee. And I had spoken to you about this just before we started, but I couldn't find you publicly anywhere. Why did you choose to take a step back?
I did lots of things, but I've never sort of marketed who I am. So I worked with Winston's Wish, I became a trustee, and then I became chair of the board.
And Winston's Wish
so Winston's Wish is a fantastic charity that helps bereaved children cope with grief. Because when a child loses a parent, a primary caregiver, it can throw their mind into chaos because they've lost an attachment figure. It's about attachment theory. When you lose that primary caregiver, your key attachment figure in life, it can cause real trauma. And if you don't help the child process that, it can cause all sorts of problems, particularly further down the road. It doesn't happen to all children, but children don't grieve openly, and so adults often assume they're okay, but they're not. They internalise it and try to process it themselves. It's really difficult. And Winston's Wish understands that and does that. And we went on a Winston's Wish weekend, the boys and myself, and it was transformative. It was wonderful. And I got involved with the charity, and over time became a trustee, and then ended up as a chair, and I'm now vice patron of the charity. And it hugely matters to me that children are supported because it can change their path through life. And it also was about finding something to do to give back, because Winston's Wish helped me, my cruise bereavement volunteer helped me, and I wanted to give back because I feel I've learned so much about grief, and I think it's often misunderstood and not enough is done. And so that's why I did it.
What would you think that everyone should know when it comes to supporting children through bereavement? Do we have enough in schools? Do we have enough in their primary, where they spend their day-to-day?
From the work I did at Winston's Wish, we did know that not a lot of schools fully understood grief and how to support children. So the key thing with a child is to acknowledge the grief, and there are some really simple things you can do. You can get information from a charity like Winston's Wish, but it is about talking to the child and, if you like, helping them find a space to normalise what's happened and to show the child that it isn't something that needs to be hidden away, ignored, pretend it hasn't happened. And it's not complicated, but there are things like, for example, on Father's Day, the first Father's Day after Nick died, the teacher at my boys' school was brilliant. She did Father's Day, and the boys made a card for their dad, but she said, "You've got a father, he's not here anymore because he died, but you two will make a Father's Day card." And she talked about it very openly in class, and it really helped them. It's just those little things like that make a huge difference to how a child deals with their grief.
And I guess they also, if you normalise it, they watch your emotions and they respond to the environments that they're in and the adults that are reacting the way they're reacting.
I mean, I think it's really important to show a child that you're grieving. And there was a time, and I remember it vividly because I could see the floorboards in my kitchen because I was lying on them, beating them and howling. And my poor sons were standing next to me, distraught. And I wish I hadn't done that, but it's how I felt. But it's better in a way that they see that grief is really painful than that they don't. Because if you pretend it's not there, they're confused. They need to know that you grieve because you've lost someone important. It's okay to grieve, but you will survive. You're teaching them that you can survive. That's what matters.
Sorry, take a break. Do you have a photo?
Please don't say sorry. This is the thing is, this is normal. It's completely normal. If you didn't do this, it would be pretty odd, wouldn't it? I mean, it would be really weird. Now, I'll just tell you as an aside a story. My bereavement counsellor told me she was visiting a 5-year-old child who had lost a sibling a year before, and the child was having psychosis. She was seeing snakes coming out of the walls.
Oh,
Okay,
gosh.
it was real psychosis.
Yeah.
And the bereavement counsellor went in and unpicked what was happening. And what had happened was the parents, when her sibling had died, the parents hid their pain from the remaining child. They cried on their own, but when they were with the child, they pretended nothing had happened. And this child couldn't understand it. It was like, I've lost my brother. What's going on? My parents don't realise the brother's gone and how much I hurt, and they don't hurt, and do they not love him?
Yeah.
And it had got so traumatic that the child had a breakdown.
My God.
And so the role of the counsellor was to go in and help them acknowledge,
figure it out,
and talk about it openly.
Yeah. So 2026. So Nick's died 20 years ago.
20 years ago this year,
20 years ago this year. And your boys are not boys. I mean, obviously I've got I can hear them in my head because I've been listening to the audio diary and I've seen their photos, but they're grown men now.
They are, they're 23.
23.
Yes.
Do you feel like 20 years was a long time ago, or does it still feel like yesterday sometimes?
It doesn't feel like 20 years at all. And that's partly because some of the things that happen are still so vivid because they were so raw. Like, I can still remember the moment of him dying. I can still remember the next morning. I can see my boys on the landing. I came out of my bedroom and I saw them on the landing, and they were both wearing blue check pyjamas, holding their toys and saying to them, I'm so sorry, but Daddy died in the night. And I can still feel that moment where they just looked at me. So much of it I can remember because, you know, it was the most profound, awful thing to have happened in my life. And so it does impact you. So no, it doesn't feel like 20 years. Sometimes I think, sometimes I just feel, I do sometimes feel cross that my boys haven't had him for 20 years. Seems really unfair. They're lovely, obviously they're lovely young men, they're my young men, so they're lovely, but I wish he could see them. I wish they could talk to him. I wish they could know him. They don't remember much about him at all. They are very like him. And I know that they had him for those early years, which was really important. But it's really sad. It's a huge loss. Just because they don't remember doesn't mean that they didn't go through childhood thinking, where's our dad? So,
was there maybe a season in that time where you thought you could almost breathe again, where that suffocation that you feel, you know, when you lose someone? When do you think you started seeing that change?
When did I breathe again? Can't really remember. It happened slowly. I suppose when work took off and I began to realise because when he died I had no work, I had nothing. And then when work took off and I was beginning to earn an income again and some money was coming in, that was a sense of relief. But I wouldn't say there was a moment.
And you write in the book as well, and I'm going to read this out again, but you say that you think some people are afraid. Maybe they scented the wounded animal's last journey, which I feel is such a powerful way to put it. You also said that there's such thing as a stigma that is attached to being bereaved, as if people come near it, they might catch it. So,
Yes.
which I think I was like upset reading the beginning, and I read the last bit and I was just like, oh gosh. Did any of those friendships that you talk about, you know, in your book and your articles, did any of those then come back, or did you find some sort of amicable peace between them?
One or two people I think, have a conversation with where I explained how hard it was to be friends with people whose lives just carried on and who, to be honest, sort of disappeared. But I became a different person. So whilst I felt really abandoned by friends, I did become a different person. So most of them it just didn't work anymore in my new life. I was no longer part of the Nick and Barbara couple, and I couldn't find a way to make it work. So, no, I feel very at peace with all of that. It is brutal, and I know that almost everybody who goes through this says the same, that most people deal with your loss very badly at a time where you need them the most, and it's very hard to forgive them.
Because you always remember who wasn't there and who was there. You do remember who wasn't there. At the time, you always remember. And you always remember who was there as well.
Do you remember that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then the book, obviously, and you also say about grief never ending. How do you think your relationship with grief has changed?
I feel more in control of it now. It is only a small part of my life now. It doesn't mean I wouldn't give anything to have him back. But it is a small part of my life, and I understand it better. I hate to say this, but I have to say it. I think it's made me a nicer person. I know, and I hate saying that, but I think it has kind of made me realise what adversity is like, and there's all sorts of different types of adversity. I've now trained as a bereavement volunteer, so I now support people in bereavement, and I think that's a really important role. I think it's just made me a little bit more... It's made me more tolerant of many things, but more intolerant of many other things, because I think... And all we have in life is the people we love and when they're here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And all we fear in life is losing them. That's what life's about. And if you don't experience that, you haven't experienced the key thing that we all feel. And to have experienced it, I suppose it just makes you face up to being human.
And someone that's listening to this right now who's potentially lost a partner or a parent or someone close to them, what's the real advice that you'd give them? Not the inspirational Instagram memes, but really like the actual, like, what would you say to them? There's
so much bad advice. Like somebody said to me, go back to the person you were before you met Nick, and you remember they survived, and you can't. And then people say time heals, and it doesn't. So the advice would be, first of all, don't think about healing, but you will get stronger. That's what you're looking for, it's strength. The second thing I would say is, don't think, where does this go? Is it going to be always like this? Because it won't always be like this. You don't know what life will bring you. I was talking to somebody shortly after Nick died, and I said, oh, this is terrible. I can't live like this, and I don't have a partner. I'm never going to love again. And he said to me, you don't know. And so when you're in that slough of despond, remind yourself you don't know where life is going to take you. It's not going to take you where you expected it to, but you don't know where. And there may be some good places. Thirdly, seek help, seek support from somewhere like Winston's Wish, the charity, or Crew's Bereavement Care. It will give you strength to deal with things. Find other people in a similar situation and just deal with your situation. I think you've got to think, this is where I am. How can I use the resources I have got to hand to get myself to a place where I'm stronger? It's not easy, but take hold of yourself in any form you can, whether it's seeking help or keeping focused on the belief you will get stronger, and get yourself there.
And what gives you joy now after all these years?
What gives me joy now is knowing that the worst happened and I survived, and a feeling that I can survive. And life still throws up all sorts of challenges, but when I do new things and learn new things and they're challenging, I always just know I can survive.
It's amazing. So that's enough with the deep questions now. We're going to coming to the end, and we're going to go into a quick fire fun round. So I'm going to ask you quick questions, and you just say the first thing that comes to your mind.
Okay.
Yeah? You ready?
Yes.
Okay. Best country you've ever filmed in?
The best country I ever filmed in was the States.
Oh. Okay.
Because 20, 30 years ago, it was great to film in the States. You didn't have a language problem. Everyone loved hearing the British voice. They loved the accent, and they were very open to being filmed, and they talk openly. I think it's changed, but I love that.
Best story you ever chased?
The best story I ever chased was a panorama I made called Men Aren't Working. And it was about how heavy industry and those traditional jobs that men in the northeast of England had relied on had disappeared, to be replaced with things like call centres, which tended to be female jobs. And we interviewed these young men still at school who wanted to go out and do physical jobs, but they weren't there. And we also interviewed their peers, young women, who were excited about the world, who were adapting to the new world and were go-getting. And it was such an insight into the way the world was changing and how the men were struggling with it. Mm-hmm. And I wish I could go back and find out where they are now.
Best BBC canteen meal back in the day?
Back in the day, we had a beautiful canteen in Television Centre with a posh bit where you could take guests. I think it had tablecloths and waiter service. And I took my mother there. I can't remember what yet, but she loved it. And it was slightly set apart in this huge, huge canteen. And it was a real event to take somebody there.
Oh, nice.
I'm sure that's gone.
So the Newsnight green room or Panorama edit suite, where did the best gossip happen?
We never had much time for gossip, but in terms of the green room, there was a green room at Newsnight, but actually the best green room ever was the one at Radio 2, where I now do my monthly chat on Radio 2, and I was in the green room at Radio 2 waiting to go on the Jeremy Vine show, and these men turned up in the lift and came into the green room, and they were all a bit edgy, and they were all wearing black, and one of them said, "McCartney's on his way up." And I thought, oh, McCartney. A minute later, into the green room walks Paul McCartney. And I looked at him and I thought, oh, my God. And there's only me in the green room.
Yeah.
And he looked at me and he went... and I thought... He then started talking to the other man in the green room. And this man looked to me like really boring. And I thought, I need to rescue Paul McCartney here. So I went up and I said, excuse me. And I said, Paul, my name's Barbara. I just want to say what you wrote about your wife's last moments was so beautiful. And when my husband died, I remembered them. Mm. And I want to thank you for that. And he looked at me and he said, I think we need a hug.
Oh.
And we had a hug. He smelled beautiful. And anyway, I went into the studio and somebody said that the man I'd pushed to one side was James Brown.
Oh.
Was it James Blunt? One of the Jameses. James Blunt. It was James Blunt. I hadn't recognised. But that was the best moment ever.
Have you ever said, I'm from the BBC to get into somewhere you shouldn't?
Only somewhere I should. I've never said it for somewhere I shouldn't. I'd never do that.
Would you rather produce one more Panorama investigation or start a TikTok account about grief?
I'd like to do another Panorama investigation. I'd love to go back and meet those young people in Darlington from 30 odd years ago and find out where their lives have gone. I loved investigating panoramas.
Would you ever go back to Panorama?
Panorama's changed hugely. I don't think I'd manage it now. The format and the style is a whole new generation making it. I still have nightmares that I haven't filmed everything and I'm not going to get my programme ready on time.
Oh,
I still think I'm there in the Panorama office in a panic about getting the show on there.
Last thing that properly made you laugh?
The last thing that made me laugh my head off was my sister is throwing out my mother's things. She's trying to clear her house. My mum's still alive, but her house is full of junk. My sister gives me my mother's junk.
Yeah.
Because my mother won't let it leave the house. So my sister pretends that I'm taking it. My mother's very happy to give it to me. I take it and I put it on the wall outside my house and someone takes it.
Oh my God.
Which is great.
Yeah.
What made me laugh so much was that last time I forgot to take it out of my car and put it on the wall. Someone broke into my car and took it themselves, and I told my sister this, and I nearly collapsed on the floor laughing at my mother's junk. I didn't even have to put it on the wall. Someone breaks in, nicks it, and I'm delighted.
Well, hopefully your mum won't watch this show, though she'll know what you do with her
She
stuff.
won't.
Guilty pleasure on TV that you watch?
Any box set. Loving Yellowstone. I love Dragon's Den and The Traitors.
Oh, I need to watch The Traitors. I feel like I'm so behind.
God, you do need to watch The Traitors.
If you weren't a journalist, what would you have been?
I would have been a lawyer fighting for something that really matters.
Yeah. And the last book that you read?
The last book I read... actually, I'm currently reading a book about a little town in southern Germany, which after the First World War... The documents there have been unearthed and they've shown how slowly the people in that town supported the Nazis. And it's a terrifying example of how bad things, far-right extremist politics can reach normal people, and in a short space of time you can go down a very dark hole. And it's quite shocking because it's just a normal little town with normal people, and Nazism takes over, and we know where that ended.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Barbara. That's the end. Thank you so much for being
Anna.
so honest on the show and, sharing a really difficult story.
Thank you
so much. Thank you so much for listening. This was an incredibly powerful yet tough episode for us to film. Barbara says grief never ends, and 20 years later, she still stands by that. But what she showed us today is that grief not ending doesn't mean life ends. You can carry both, the love and the loss, the pain and the joy, the memory and the future. That's what resilience looks like. Thank you so much for listening. And if you found value in this episode, I would really appreciate if you could subscribe to our channel and share with others. It really helps us to bring more human stories on the show that often don't get told. Thank you, and see you on the next one.